And I am the co-host governments are going to be active on cybersecurity issues because it's, it's costing the global economy $7 trillion, et cetera, et cetera. But fundamentally, security voices need to be part of that. And so that's the thing I'm trying to do, is trying to help.
One thing I got involved with when I was working at Microsoft was helping to co-author the ISO standards for vulnerability disclosure, vulnerability handling practices. A lot of organizations use them. A lot of them crib sheet them and paraphrase them incorrectly. And then in about 2016, after helping the Commerce Department sort through what needed to change in the Wassenaar arrangement, I was invited by the State Department to join the delegation, help renegotiate some exemptions to the Wassenaar arrangement, which, if you don't know, is a group of countries that will agree on policy around export control. And there were some unintended consequences with their attempts to control intrusion software and intrusion software technology. So I helped get exemptions for vulnerability disclosure and incident response. And, there's more work to be done there. And now, in terms of my policy work with the U.S. government, I'm on 3 federal advisory boards. My government has honored me with unpaid labor. I'm so happy about that. But here's a funny story about me and Jen. We swapped intros to each other's governments. I had never met any members of Congress, and she had not yet met NCSC. So we made those intros for each other because she had testified before my Congress before I did, and I testified before the EU Parliament before she did. So it's a small world in policy. Anyway, over to you.
Hello, my name is Joseph Stevens. I'm the token government suit for the day, so I'll be the punching bag on the stage. But I'm the Director of Resilience for the National Cybersecurity Centre. I've worked in the NCSE for the past 5 years. I've worked in various different roles, starting out as looking at compliance, so going out to hospitals, to airports, to power plants, and checking the levels of compliance against regulation. So I have that experience, and then working on the other side of the coin on working with operators to try and increase their levels of security, sharing threat intelligence, sharing best practice, and basically trying to assist them when responding to incidents. So I've seen both sides from the government aspect, and now I'm Director of Resilience, which is all of the non-operational aspects of the NCSE. So anything that's not hands-on keyboard, responding to incidents, policy, regulation, and trying to implement those in Ireland. My background is military, so it's very much been public service my whole life. And I'm here today to try and make the point that sensible regulation is what's needed in cybersecurity.
Hi, I'm Kieran Martin. I was a government suit for 23 years, but 3 years ago I became a university professor, so I traded in the blazer and bought a cardigan. And I did a lot of policy in my 23 years, including 7 years of cyber policy, things like data protection, IoT regulation, 5G and Huawei. That was great fun. That went very well. And now I teach cyber policy and government at the University of Oxford. I do a bunch of corporate work, including looking at the slide, I better say, including a bit with SANS, because they're the only one on that slide. And like Katie, I have the pleasure of being employed for free by a number of governments advisory, including at the moment the US and Australia.
Thank you all. Okay, a starter question for everyone. Does the panel think that government regulations will hinder or help organisations to become more secure, in that organisations will look to do the bare minimum to comply? Now, Katie, I'll come to you first on this, actually, because, as you mentioned, you've been involved lately in a lot of policy formulation, and you mentioned on Twitter yesterday, yes, I still look, why tech people need to get involved in putting together regulations is because, and I quote, if we try to sit it out, the regulations destroy what we've built. So can you build on that, please?
Well, that's exactly been my experience, right? The internet, as I like to say, was built on rock and roll and silly string. And, I think that regulators have come in with an imperfect understanding of the technology. They try to get advice from the tech sector, but most often they get it from lobbyists who may have, more corporate and commercial interests in mind, and not necessarily the health and privacy and safety of the internet as a whole. So the true technology practitioners are getting roped in to having more and more of these conversations, and, usually on a volunteer basis. And unfortunately, does it result in an even distribution of clear, accurate, and helpful tech policy? No, unfortunately, it does not, because it's not, it's a much more ad hoc process. And a lot of times, regulators will only come to us in the tech sector when they've kind of already come to their internal conclusion, and they're looking for validation or like super red flags. But if you try to get them to pull back on any of their objectives that they originally set out to do, you're going to hit a brick wall. So I think for me, in participating in some of these discussions, it's been an exercise in learning empathy for what mission are they trying to accomplish in their regulation, and finding a way to do that as constructively and least destructively as possible. And the Wassenaar stuff was an example of that, where at first we were like, please stop that. Do not regulate that. Please don't. And they said, what? We regulated cryptography. That worked out great. And we kind of reminded them of something called the crypto wars that ensued. But in essence, what ended up happening was we had to empathize and find a way to move forward. And that was where those exemptions came from, because we were able to align the purpose that they did not intend to disrupt incident response and vulnerability disclosure. And that was what, in fact, they had written.
Can I just hijack and ask the audience some questions? Because I love to do that. So for those of you who are lucky enough to still be part of the EU, the EU is super active on cyber policy. Can I have a show of hands? How many people feel that they're actually up on what's going on? Like what policy is being reviewed or considered or is in progress? Awesome. If you had put your hand up, I probably would have said, you're probably not. Just because it's a lot and it's confusing. How many people would have an interest in potentially helping the development of policy if it led to better policy outcomes? I definitely asked that in a way that made it hard to say no. Okay, well, not that many hands went up, so you're all kind of like, no, I have a full-time job, I'm good, thanks, let the government do the government thing. Okay. How many people feel pretty up on what their own government is doing on cyber policy? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. I noticed you had your hand up there, Kieran, so let's bring you in on that.
I was only going to answer Jen's question, didn't want to say anything. So look, the question you posed, you can give the classic answer in cybersecurity in any subject, it depends. Is regulation going to make it any better or not? I think, but we're past the stage whether I think inactivity in governments, even, the US government, which will always be the last to regulate business, particularly American business, which a lot of this is, crossed the threshold this year, at least intellectually, with its March strategy and said, look, we've been too inactive. Now, whether the US goes and passes loads of legislation because of gridlock in Congress is another matter. But I think by and large we're in an era now where the question is not will government or should governments do anything, it's what will they do, because they will do stuff. So it's what's good and what's bad. And I've seen all sorts of bad and good examples. So there are some good examples. I won't embarrass the person, but I know there's someone here from Ofcom in the UK who is charged with developing new regulations for telecoms infrastructure security. And that's a really good example, because what happened was the telcos came to us when I was in the NCSC in the UK, which I was in charge of for quite a while. And they said, look, you keep coming to us with evidence of breaches and compromises and vulnerabilities, and you keep asking us nicely to fix them. But that's getting really expensive, and the business model doesn't work anymore, because if we do this and you don't, and the competitor doesn't, then we're at risk unless the competitor is popped. And that's not fair. You need to bake this into the regulations. So we said, okay. And there is a law, unusually, which was not contentious, and all the standards are now being developed with the industry. That's a good example. The way IoT legislation, I know a lot of people don't like it, but the way, we had Dave Lewis on earlier showing us the Mirai botnet and all the default passwords, the way that's essentially been banned in most of this continent, in a way that hasn't broken the market. It's quite a good example. There are all sorts of bad examples. I, like Jen, I'm a fan of the European Union. I am quite skeptical about its approach to tech regulation. During the pandemic, when I was really bored, one of the Irish MEPs, again, I won't embarrass by saying who it was, said, "Oh, could you come and give evidence on this DORA thing?" I said, "What's DORA?" And I explained the Digital Operation Resilience Act. And I said, "Well, I've not heard of it. I have now." And so I read it. So, if you want to know the nadir of pandemic boredom, I just sat in a shed one day and read the Digital Operation Resilience Act. And it was just a bunch of things that you had to do. I really struggled, read it twice, because it was like, where's the bit about actual outcomes and keeping banking going and so forth? And there are other examples, not so much government policy, but the way insurance policies. Lloyd's of London did this really, really strange sort of thing around excluding when they'd pay out when nation states were involved, which had clearly never been shown to anybody who had any experience of the way governments deal with nation state attacks. Because the whole thing, I can explain more, but I won't for reasons of time. And then Katie is, I'll defer to her on this, but she's got a long and brilliant history of campaigning and forcing change on stuff where governments are doing active harm, where people who are trying to do good in the cybersecurity industry feel at risk of criminal penalties because of the way laws are framed. What's the common thread between the good and the bad? I think there are two common threads about what determines whether you're on one side or the other. The first is understanding of the tech. I went into cybersecurity as head of what became the National Cybersecurity Centre with no background in the subject, but at least access to technologists who could speak in plain English. So they could explain and they were deeply expert. So you could mesh that and fuse that. And the second thing is whether you're talking to the right people. So if you're trying to frame insurance policy guidelines on paying out for nation states and you don't talk to governments and you just talk to other insurers, which is what they did, you mess it up. If you try and frame telecoms regulation without talking to telecoms operators, you mess it up. So there will be a lot of regulation, and I think we know how to do it well and how to do it badly.
Thank you. Joe, I'd like you to come in on this because, as you mentioned, you've been there sort of on the front lines. You've seen where the rubber meets the road, how regulations get applied. What have you seen? Yeah,
a couple of points. So the first is we designed telecoms legislation in a very similar way to the UK. So what we didn't do is we didn't start with the law and then tell them work it out. We got in with all of the telecom operators, figured out what was going to work, designed what measures would actually work first, and then built the law around that. And that model worked much better. And I think there's actually parallels with, we're probably going to talk a lot about how products need to be secure by design, but I think laws need to be, sane by design. And that works by starting at the start, understanding the tech first, not doing the law first, and then hoping the tech works out, because we're not going to re-engineer the internet with our legislation. We're going to have to build the legislation around the way things work at the moment. And then on my experience, again, echoing what Kieran said, we actually found we expected going out to companies who'd never been regulated before to be greeted with, not the friendliest welcome, but we had cybersecurity professionals saying, "This is great. I've been shouting about, I wanted these things for years and we couldn't, but now that it's, now that we're legally obliged to do it, it makes it much, much easier." And we also had the executives as well saying, we knew that this was what we needed to do, but we knew our competitor wouldn't. And if they didn't, then we're not going to do it because, they're going to outcompete us. So I think that's where regulation works well, where it creates the right incentives, not, where it has perverse outcomes.
Can I just come on that point that you made? So when the UK government was looking at consumer IoT, the piece that you just referenced, Kieran, they did a series of consultations, right? Policy is generally developed through a series of consultations so that they can get voices responding. I will just say as a quick aside, the problem is that often the people who respond to consultations are the people who have a commercial interest in some way, and they hear too infrequently from security professionals. So if you see a consultation and you have an interest in the topic, please do participate in the consultation, have your say, help to create a better output. But nonetheless, so they ran these consultations. One of the things that they heard back that they were actually quite surprised by was the manufacturers came back and said, "We don't want to compete on security." They actually kind of said, no, we would rather that you set the baseline. And so security is not the thing we're competing on. We're competing on features and usability and all that good stuff. So it just sort of, building on that point.
Now, a question again for Katie. The technology lobby, and we heard, from Jen just how, some of the interested parties can get involved in an early stage. They often argue that too much regulation stifles innovation. Do they have a point?
I mean, I think, honestly, it depends, right? It depends on how large of an organization they apply this to. But I'll give you an example where size of organization actually didn't matter. And this was, any of you remember the audio social media company called Clubhouse? It was a blip on the pandemic radar. It got really, really popular, and then Twitter added voice to their their offerings, and Clubhouse still exists, I guess. But I hacked Clubhouse, and I went to disclose the vulnerability to them, and what happened was one, there was no way to really report the vulnerability to them, but two, when I finally did get in touch, they were willing to put me into a private bug bounty program, which meant sign a non-disclosure, get paid. And I was like, I don't need your money. I need you to fix this because it's dangerous, right? And they said that they were a 5-person company at the time. They were evaluated at $4 billion at the time. So if we look at regulation from the standpoint of does it stifle innovation, and if you try to gate it by size of the company or by revenue, you're going to miss things like 10 million users on an app called Clubhouse staffed by 5 entrepreneurs worth $4 billion. There's a whole cacophony of different, meters that could be confused in that scenario. The fact of the matter was, they weren't protecting their users' data or privacy or et cetera. And the hack was that you could be a poltergeist in the room and not able to not be seen by anybody in the room listening in, and you could vocally disrupt the room. So you could be a very loud poltergeist in the room. Anyway, I think the moral of that story is that it's very difficult to set logical bars by which you don't enforce some of this compliance. And it's very easy to end up catching organizations that should be potentially exempt for a period of time in order to not stifle innovation. But it's hard to draw those lines given how muddy things are in that example I gave.
Joe, you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, just wanted to back up that point. It's actually too important for that argument, in my opinion. And it's when you respond to incidents. So we all read reports about how, cybercrime is costing 1 trillion or whatever each report says each year, and it's getting worse and it's getting worse. But it's when you hear the human stories of ransomware on hospitals, and, when we responded to the HSE incident in the early days of that response, we were hearing about cancer patients who had to stop their treatment mid-treatment because they didn't know how much radiation they'd received. And anybody in the room who's gone through that process knows how devastating that news is. There was staff who were overworked because of the response to COVID, then having to deal with this on top of it, having to go to paper, hospitals in chaos. And that's kind of what you're dealing with. That it's become far too important. We're not in the early days of the internet where it was, the silly string and rock and roll. It's what our society is built on. So I think that to say that, okay, but it's going to stifle innovation, it may a little bit, but it's too important not to. And, if we didn't put car safety in place, I'm sure we'd have really cool cars, but we'd also have ones that blow up. Well, we still do a little bit with Musk, but,
Kieran, I'll bring you in here.
And just really quickly, I think, does regulation stifle innovation? I mean, it's one of the oldest economic questions around. So, and obviously in theory, yes. But I think in this subject, it's worth splitting it out between people using technology and people providing it, because they're two quite different things. So to Joe's examples, if you're running healthcare, if you're running energy, some of the sectors and some of the debate, particularly, but not exclusively in the US, we've got highly regulated sectors like energy. I find the whole debate around colonial pipeline regulation completely daft. People saying, well, if you get involved in the government, it's going to, scare people. It's one of the most regulated sectors in the world for safety, for provision and so forth, But the idea that people are terrified in the oil business of liaising with the government on regulations is preposterous. On the other hand, in tech, I think that in tech provision and development, the question does really arise. And I think, probably you look at the 90s, the noughties, on balance, innovation let rip, and we could have done with a little bit more of tightening of controls, because we're paying the price of that now. On the other hand, one of the issues now that I think we do have to watch is regulatory capture in the AI discussion, where, it's pretty obvious that some of the big players would be perfectly happy if there was a pretty sort of draconian framework that entrenched their dominance or their sort of pre-positioned leadership in the innovation race.
Thank you. Jen, I'll bring you in here because, we've talked about how in many cases regulations are necessary. In some cases they're expected in certain sectors. Security traditionally has relied an awful lot on the end user to do the right thing. Is it a case that in security it's better to have regulations that compel vendors to do the right thing, to bake in better protection to their products? And have you seen that in practice in the discussions that you've had?
Yeah, so I think in security policy conversations we have focused on the user organization for a really long time, and that has now started to swing in the other direction. We've started to see things like secure by design becoming much more of a topic. Software. Kieran mentioned the US's national cybersecurity strategy earlier, and one of the things that came out that was a huge headline in that was they implied that software liability might be something that they start to consider down the road. And actually, if you look at the conversations around AI, that is leading us pretty directly into conversations around software liability. The EU AI Act actually kind of really lent in hard on that for a while. So I think from what I'm seeing is there is now a recognition that putting all of the burden on the end user organization isn't the right approach. There's also been sort of lines of inquiry looking at sort of digital service providers and the role that they play, and whether you can kind of move the responsibility kind of upstream a little bit, and therefore create much greater, broader impact by regulating the few. And I think that also ties to the rise of supply chain risk and the fact that we're trying to tackle that. So I think, the bottom line is that actually this is a journey we're on, and it will continue, right? We're not even, I don't think, in the middle of it, because I don't think we're making enough progress to think we're in the middle of it. I think we're still just really actually in the early stages of this journey, and it's going to continue as our rate of adoption of connected technologies continues, and as the sort of innovation around them continues, and new risks emerge, and our understanding matures and develops. And I think there will continue to be a view of looking at, there is no, I hate to use this phrase because how many times a day do we hear it in security, but there is no silver bullet. So as with your security programs, where it's a combination of elements that you're leveraging together that all work together to create impact, policy's the same. It's lots of little things that they're doing, and some will target the end user organizations and some will target the vendor organizations. Okay.
Now a question for all of you. What we might do is we'll start with Kieran and then work our way back. Obviously, regulations will look to set a certain baseline, if you like, or minimum security standard, but is there a risk that they could create a kind of a checklist mentality? And speaking on behalf of the audience, say organizations who are tasked with maybe following a particular regulation, is it possible to strike a balance between compliance, but actually a bit more of a proactive and risk-based approach to security that isn't just about, okay, I meet this bare baseline, I've got my tick, thank you very much. Is there a way we can strike that balance?
Probably, and it's really hard, and it'll change all the time, and it'll never be perfect. There are some extremes. So, you can go for a compliance and box ticking, the sort of thing that I mentioned earlier with the Digital Operation Resilience Act, which I thought was quite box ticky, and so forth. On the other hand, my understanding of, at the other extreme of the Colonial Pipeline, case was the regulatory obligation was, if the pipeline is switched off for whatever reason, have it back up and running within 7 days, which is probably too loose of an outcome-based regulation at the other end. So there's probably somewhere in between, for different, circumstances. But just if I can piggyback on the last point about where you're putting it at vendor level, I think that is ultimately, where where possible, where the direction of policy should be. It is difficult, and I think the only thing I'd want to add to what Jen said is that it is genuinely difficult. So it seems to be easier for hardware, for stuff we can literally physically hold. The software side of it, the secure by default stuff, it reminds me a little bit, if you have, thankfully here in Dublin, you don't have to have the misfortune of following the British government's travails over its Rwanda asylum legal problems. But if you were following yesterday, and I don't recommend it, what happened was the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom declared that it is not safe to send people to Rwanda. And the British government's response to this is that Parliament is going to pass a law declaring that Rwanda is safe. So, in a sense, sometimes I think with the secure by design slogan, we might as well get Parliament to pass an act saying software is safe, when we know that it's not. So actually, a lot of the problem with this type of regulation is it's really, really difficult to make software safe. So mandating in law that it should be is not credible in and of itself. It'd be transformative if we get it right, so that's the sort of places we should be putting. And it comes back to the whole point that we've been talking about since Katie kicked us off. Just this stuff needs testing and engagement and involvement and piloting and all of that stuff.
I don't disagree with most of it. Pretty much everything you've said there. To the direct answer to the question about whether it should be compliance based or not, or tick boxy, it's almost impossible to solve that issue. And I think, as Kieran alluded to, it's really, really challenging and difficult. I do think at times you need checklists. There needs to be some sort of, people need to know what's expected of them. But it can't just be, that changes so often that it can't be rigid, and it needs to be based on risk, and it needs to be where I've seen regulation work best is where it's an engagement between the regulator and the entity rather than someone coming out literally checking a list. It's where they're understanding the business, understanding how they quantify risk, understanding what's acceptable for them, what the impact would be, and an independent regulator making a determination if that's appropriate or not.
Yeah, I think that, so in my particular area of expertise, we see a lot of organizations jumping on the vulnerability disclosure program bandwagon, and they are ticking a box. They are saying, we have a vulnerability disclosure program. What they're missing is the capacity to actually deal with the vulnerabilities, and that's always been missing, and that was always the problem. And so even though we're seeing, increased adoption of some of these, good practices, best practices, it's the outcomes that we still aren't measuring in part of this regime. There's a regulatory regime, but it doesn't require you to measure how effective any of these controls really have been. It's like, do them, but then how did that turn out for you? And previous attempts at, trying to quantify security, doing vulnerability counts are absolutely incorrect. They incentivize the wrong types of behavior. They incentivize not looking for vulnerability. Like, no, we've got hardly any, didn't look. But I think that what I'm seeing now is this inkling towards maturing, some of these efforts to be a little bit more culpable about how these outcomes are panning out. That's definitely the recommendations I'm giving in one of my free advice to the U.S. government, is that with any of these pushes, for secure software development, secure by design, CISA, in the U.S., put out a nice paper referencing older, nicer papers about the same topic, and they didn't say anything about measuring outcomes. And so we kind of one of my boards wrote a letter saying, you should probably include this. And the last thing I'll finish on here is that, and I think this touches on what you said earlier, or one of the points you made earlier, Jen, is that, we're in the middle of this, but think about how new this industry actually is, right? And how even self-regulation and attempting to stave off the inevitable software liability is still so new. The Trustworthy Computing memo from Microsoft came out 21 years ago. Microsoft itself did not have a vulnerability disclosure policy until I wrote it in 2010. 13 years ago. So if we're thinking about this like, let's just write a bunch of regulations at this point, we're barely a couple decades in. This industry can barely drink.
So I think also we should think about the fact that we're talking about regulation as if sort of as if it's popcorn, right? Like, cheap and easy to come by. The reality is that regulation is kind of a last resort for governments. It's really, really time consuming. It's really expensive. It can be politically charged. It's kind of a pain in the ass, to be completely honest. And so, why do governments do it? Why bother, right? And the answer is because we need to see behavioral change, and we need to figure out a way of forcing that to happen, because the market incentives work in the wrong direction, right? We hoped that it would all take care of itself over time, that things would kind of shake out, we'd have a matured understanding of risk, and then people would start voting with their money, right? They go to their vendors and they demand behavioral change, and the world would be a beautiful sunny place. And it turns out that didn't happen. So now we're looking at regulation, and it is a kind of last resort thing. And yes, it places a huge burden on security professionals, but it also is an opportunity. How many people have heard the expression, never let a good crisis go to waste? I feel like in security, this is practically a religion, right? Compliance is the same thing, right? Yes, it's a pain because you have to be able to check those boxes, and you're going to get asked questions about it. But those questions, that's the opportunity for a conversation, right? That's air cover that you maybe didn't have the day before. It's resources that you maybe didn't have the day before that you can now go to leadership and have that conversation with. That's why the government puts the regulation in place. So again, and I know I'm very call to action for all of you, and I'm very Pollyanna about this, but the reality is that you guys have the ability to make or break it, right? To go, either I'm going to view this purely as a burden, or I'm going to view this as an opportunity to go start a conversation, to get the resources I need, to start talking about why the government has introduced this policy and why attitudes are changing. And don't just look at the regulatory stuff, look at things like codes of practice as well, because that is indicative of a group of leaders having got together and said, we see a problem and this is the behavior we think this should be. And you can leverage that to have really good conversations and start kind of hopefully getting more resources, getting more support, having more political influence inside your organizations. I believe we have hope.
And to follow on from that, are there any examples of regulations or indeed compliance frameworks, again, thinking of the audience in mind, that have improved organizations' security posture? And again, to take up your point, Katie, about having measurable outcomes, are there any measurable outcomes from any of those particular frameworks or regulations that we can point to? You're laughing, so I'll go to you first.
I'm laughing because I can't think of any. But maybe it's lack of imagination. Jen, can you think of any?
So I'll go to what Katie said earlier is we're still really early in the process, and the legislation that we have seen is still really young. So Kieran mentioned a couple of pieces of legislation. They literally came in last year, at the end of last year. So and because of the weird way that the UK does stuff, actually the sort of implementation window hasn't opened. If you look at something like CERCIA, which is the Critical Infrastructure Cyber Incident Reporting Act. Thank you. I'm so impressed. I remember that. The US government literally, Congress basically went, "Ooh, hot potato. Let's throw it at SISA." And so they said, "SISA, you've got 4 years to come up with what this should have." And admittedly, there are people who went, "I'm sorry, what now? 4 years?" But the reason for that is because it's complicated and it's hard to get it right. So I think there will be, again, I have hope. I feel like people are going to start throwing things at me soon, but I have hope that there will be benefit, that we will see impact, but I don't think it happens overnight. And if you think about something like food labeling, food labeling was a thing that when it first started happening, I think people mostly were either ambivalent or didn't really see the point. I think the number of people who were super enthusiastic about that was marginal. And I don't think there was any point specifically where we went, "Oh, food labeling's had an impact." I can now say it's had an impact. But today, sitting here, I think probably everybody in the room would agree that as a general society, we have a much better ability to have conversations now about what goes into our food, about what it means for something to be a GMO, and for E-numbers and food colorings and all those kinds of things that we didn't talk about at all 20 years ago, really. And so I think that's the thing, is it's a depressing message to say, in 20 years, ask me how we've done. But in 20 years, ask me how we've done.
No, I do want to So she's very hopeful, and I'm very goth, and pink is the new black. So I do want to point out, many of you are too young to remember the crypto wars, and that is an example of where regulation actually defeated and lowered security for years to come afterwards. And it was because the regulation was you couldn't export certain cipher strength of cryptography, right? And that made it so that browsers, where the internet, the gateway to the internet, all browsers had to support much lower levels of encryption than, attackers knew how to break. So that we suffered because of that. The whole internet suffered because of that regulation. And it took a very long time to undo that damage. And that is my primary reason for being involved, even though I would love to do other things with my time than worry about regulation, but that is exactly what I'm trying to prevent is, shouting into the wind while these regulations do damage to cybersecurity and privacy.
Well, I'll try and recover some optimism then after that because I'm not disagreeing with Katie at all, but I think I think the Goths have almost won the crypto wars by now. There's been a lot of collateral in the end, and there may be some people still fighting, perhaps forlornly, including some governments that I have been very closely associated with in the past. But the crypto wars have been won by the Goths, by the computer security people. More prosaically, if I was sitting in the audience and was thinking, right, so they can't actually think of a single example of a regulatory initiative that's done any good. I'll try one, and it's not very fashionable because it's banking, and nobody likes them. It's not the easiest way to make a popular case, but the way banking regulation worked has been pretty good in cyberspace, I would assert. In the UK story, it was quite important. So after the great crash of 2008, the Bank of England's financial stability mandate was enhanced in law, and Mark Carney, the Canadian who was the governor at the time, said to the government, well, this new thing you've given me in law called financial stability, and you've done two sub-definitions of it. One was operational resilience. Can't remember what the other one was. So he said operational resilience, this cybersecurity thing people are talking about, sounds like it could be part of it. Can I talk to some experts? And it's one of the reasons the NCSC was formed. That's another story. The story that's relevant here is that but it was quite important in the UK deciding not to have a cyber regulator. It would have cyber regulations for banking, for energy and so forth, was that, a bunch of us would go and see the Bank of England people and say, well, this is what good network security looks like. And said, you have no idea how banking works, do you? He said, either that will collapse the bank or it will bankrupt it or whatever. And we say, okay, fine. Thank you. Let's put something in an operational environment. And the way banking regulation, and plenty of people here, and apologies that I, for comic effect, offended you and insulted your industry, but people know how it works. You can perpetrate cyber harm on banks. People do it all the time. Sadly, some of it gets through, but it's incredibly difficult to trigger a crisis of financial stability via a cyber attack because of the way the regulations work. You can access this amount of money, but not the whole bank, etc., etc. So I do think that the way in which the banking regulation has adapted to cyber by promoting, resilience and stability, as opposed to making sure that you just can't defraud the odd €10 here and there, is actually a good example of regulation working with the grain of what the industry and what wider society needs. So there's at least one. I'll try and think of some more.
Good stuff. And Joseph, just to bring you in there as well, again, thinking of the audience and how they can go back to their workplaces and get ready for regulations that either are coming to their industry or will be here shortly. How can they apply them in a way that makes security better?
So I think the first thing they can do is we have a stand upstairs with lots of people who are there to talk about NIS2, which is coming down the tracks, and they've lots of nice leaflets to give you too. But I think really the way to approach it is using security best practices and frameworks like the NIST cybersecurity framework, or that's flexible, that can adapt to their industry. And really, so if you're a cybersecurity professional and that's what you're involved in, and really what I think that the key difference for me between NIS1 and NIS2, apart from the broad scope of entities that are going to be involved, is it shifts the burden away from the people in this room, the cybersecurity professionals, and places it at the corporate level. So it's corporate responsibility. It's responsibility for the board of directors and the executive team, that they are the ones who need to firstly approve the cybersecurity measures, supervise their implementation, and be liable for infringement where they don't meet the measures. And I think that's where we need to go, because it's not fair, and it doesn't work, placing this burden on cybersecurity professionals. And I think, the cases we've seen in the US where because there isn't that type of legislation in place and CISOs are being pursued through the courts, isn't what we want to see here. So I think that's a big change. So really, I would say the people in this room need to communicate that message to their board, because I'm not sure it's reached every boardroom where this legislation is going to apply.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, at this point, we'll open to questions from the floor. We should have some roving microphones, so please put your hands up. And if I can just ask you, when you're asking your question, to say the name of the person that you want to direct it to. I see a hand up right down the center row here. So if we can get a mic to them. Okay, the mic is a little slow in coming, so maybe you might just stand up and use your theatre voice broadcast to the backstage here.
Excuse me. Hi, I'm Paul Walsh from Medicert. I had a private briefing with Comreg this week at their office, and then I also met with the head of fraud for all of the operators across the country for SMS phishing attacks. And the one thing that I learned was there's a very specific law in Ireland that the operators are not allowed to not just inspect the content of a message, but they're not allowed to open it because of an old law that dates back. And so my recommendation to them was not to wait for a change in law, but to get opt-in in Ireland among subscribers to make sure they actually started as soon as possible. So that's my comment. But my question is, phishing was first discovered on the AOL network in 1996, where Adrian and I actually were first targeted by hackers. And it was inside emails. I'm with Katie, by the way, on regulation. I've consulted on parliamentary inquiries, and they don't take it seriously when it comes from industry. So with phishing, it's not new. It's been in emails, messages, instant messenger, and it contains a dangerous link. And today we see major companies like Cisco, Microsoft, Twilio, Okta being breached with phishing attacks on their employees, because it's virtually impossible to stop a persistent targeted attack. So when do you think the security world will potentially migrate to a zero trust approach to URLs and web access authentication? Question for anybody involved in security.
Right, who wants to feel that?
I can take it. So I do think you're right in that, phishing is going to get through. And I think the advice of telling people not to click on links is way outdated. That's what people's job is. It's to click on links. It's to open attachments. And we can't continue to place the burden on users. And we need to come up with systems. But also equally, if an organization, if their whole network falls down because somebody clicked on a link, that's not the user's fault. So I think that we do need to move away from that advice. In terms of the comment you made about the legislation, I think there's valid reasons for why governments and regulators can't inspect, or telcos can't inspect the content of messages, and that's the e-privacy directive. However, the new update that's still been negotiated at Europe for the last 3, 4, 5 years or something like that does allow for proportional inspection for cybersecurity reasons. So hopefully that will bring about a change where telcos can basically block that spam that's coming through to everybody's phone. But at the moment, for very valid reasons, they're not allowed to inspect and look inside what I'm sending to my friends and colleagues.
Thank you.
Can I just say, your example of where you've taken an approach and not waited for legislation, great. My experience is that if you can do that, if you can find a non-regulatory way to move forward, absolutely do that. And if any of you have found a problem and you can get some of your community together on solving it yourselves, I don't work for the government, but I'm pretty sure the government would much rather you guys do it that way than they have to intervene and spend their time on it. So, yeah.
Okay.
Bravo.
Agreeing with Jen fully. use whatever mechanism internally you can to jumpstart that pre-compliance with anticipated regulation. Trustworthy computing started in marketing. Use your internal hacking, organizational hacking skills to get the resources you need to get it done.
Great point. We had another question just from the center row. Can we get a mic down there, please? Here you go. Gentleman with the hands up there.
So I just wanted to make a point on a topic called SBOM, which is software building materials, and what everyone thinks in the collective here, what we're going to do with it.
Oh dear God.
I second that.
We were joking earlier that we were going to end up in fisticuffs. This might be the moment it happens.
Okay, I will start because I have very strong opinions about this. So in terms of vendors producing SBOMs, I think that's an excellent thing, and I think vendors should do that. In terms of how organizations can consume them in a useful and timely manner, that is still up for debate. And when the Cyber Safety Review Board, one of the boards I serve on for DHS, examined the Log4j incident, I made sure to ask every single respondent who talked to us, how did you use SBOMs, either as a vendor producing them or as a consumer? You know, how did you use them in the response to this? And in one very particular and interesting bit of information, a major vendor said, well, our problem wasn't that we were vulnerable. It's that all the scanners were saying that anything below, you know, whatever the latest version 2.x was vulnerable. We were so old and out of date that actually we had the 1. Version that had none of this code present, but we were still lighting up the scanners. So essentially, our SBOMs that we put out didn't change our customers' reaction because their scanners were lighting up saying we were vulnerable. So we had to roll patches anyway. So not only did that, you know, drive relatively unnecessary for that particular vulnerability. I'm sure there were others, you know, that upgrade addressed, but it just drove a lot of headless chicken busy work in an already extremely, you know, fraught event. So how, like I said, SBOMs produced, go for it. Please do so if you are a producer of software and have components that you should enumerate. But in terms of determining exploitability and using it in real time in an attack, I don't think so.
I'm going to shock everyone by being a little bit more optimistic on this topic.
Let's fight.
Right. But I actually think there's not much to fight over because I agree with the foundation of everything that you said. Like, yes, right now the value that can be realized from an SBOM is absolutely on the vendor side. And if you make software, you should totally be leveraging it to make sure that you understand what the risk associated with your product is. And you should be having conversations with anybody that supports components that you are including. On the user side, on the end user organization side, the reality is the market hasn't caught up. We have a chicken and egg problem whereby until there's a standardization around what an SBOM should look like and how it should be delivered, and until end user organizations are asking for it at volume, then the vendors that make software that an SBOM would integrate with aren't going to start focusing on that piece of development, right? So then there's no value because you don't have a way of integrating it usefully. So you end up with situations like Katie mentioned. So there is a likelihood, or maybe a potential would be a better way of putting it, that in years to come, SBOMs could be enormously valuable for end user organizations. But in order for that to happen, you have to have things like asset management and patch management and vulnerability management and inventory management systems integrate the input, right? And today they don't. And actually, part of the reason they don't is because the people who make those technologies aren't hearing from their customers that that's a priority for them. They're hearing about other things that are priorities, and so they're applying development resources to those other things. So if it's something that you're interested in and you think there could be benefit for your organization, the thing I would say is go to the vendors that you work with and say, when is this going to be a feature set that you're offering me?
Thanks, Jen. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. I saw there's a hand up here and there's another hand up, a gentleman just behind the man with the mic. I think we had a hand up just there. No, and if not, okay, we'll go to this person here in the fourth row. Thanks for your patience.
Hey, how's it going? Really enjoying the debate so far. Just in regards to when we were thinking about the benefits of regulation, I'm surprised data privacy didn't come up, especially in regards to like tracking of children, or even just organizations are more conscious now of the data that they have because of the financial repercussions. I'm just curious why maybe that wasn't mentioned.
I had considered mentioning it, but I was worried. I didn't want to. Kieran gave such a great example. I was worried it mightn't land quite as well as his one did. But I think it's an excellent example. And I was in with a tech company yesterday afternoon, and we were discussing how they're thinking about privacy in a much different way. I won't say it's directly related to GDPR. It's other issues, but that's not the way tech companies traditionally how their business model worked. And regulations like that do force people to make decisions that maybe go against how they traditionally would have done things, but are a benefit to users and society. I
also thought about bringing up it's privacy regulation, not security regulation, and while I tend to think you can't have one without the other, there are elements in GDPR for sure that create friction for security, shall we say. So that's why I didn't bring it up.
Yeah, I mean, we do have to talk about it. I think, firstly, there is something on, if I can, just, I'm afraid, butcher your question a bit, because there's actually sort of classic data protection, which is both security and privacy. I think we're evolving interestingly in that space, because my view, slightly caricatured view in the interest of time, is that there have been two models of regulation for data protection. There's been the sledgehammer and nothing, and there's been very little in between. And I think, GDPR is the sledgehammer, and the sledgehammers have their place. And certainly there was a time and a place for a sledgehammer, and you can argue GDPR was it. But there's very little subtlety, certainly in the way it's been applied. Sometimes I think we're starting to see a little bit more subtlety. This is more of a decision, an example of how something landed, is because the regulatory enforcement isn't there yet. But in August in the UK, the entire Electoral Commission database went missing, and the government said it was a nation state, didn't say which one. For a few hours, it was, very scary headlines, 40 million people, etc., basically every adult. And then after a while, people sort of calmed down, because they realized that actually this was a combination of publicly available data, or data that you could buy for 650 times 50 pence, because you could buy it constituency by constituency. And therefore it wasn't a terribly useful data set that didn't tell you very much. Whereas on the same day, a couple of hours up the road in Belfast, there was the accidental leak of the police service database of only 10,000 people, and everybody instinctively understood that's far, far worse, because in a sensitive security environment with people in sensitive operational jobs, that telling you which police station they work in, etc. So I thought that was quite interesting in terms of the maturity, and I would expect, probably saying something I shouldn't, because pending regulatory enforcement, I suspect the data protection and the information commissioner who enforces the law will be more punitive over the policing, 10,000 records, than over the electoral commission, 40 million records. So that is quite interesting. I think over time, regulation will have to get much more subtle and attuned to harm caused by data leaks. I would just endorse, and I will leave it there because I know we're running out of time, I would just endorse, we shouldn't shy away in this community from when security, as classically defined by people like us, gets into tension with other things that sound good, like privacy. They're not the same thing. They do lead to tension, and, child safety, security, privacy. We all want all of those things, but that doesn't mean that doing one thing doesn't have knock-on effects on the other that we wouldn't like.
Thank you. We have time for just one question, if there is still one from the audience. No hands up today. Oh, wait, there's a hand up right here, just to my right. Keep your hand up, please, so we can get the mic to you. Okay, thank you.
So I'm working in the telco industry, and several of our customers have been in the situation where they know that there's malware on end user equipment, and they've really not felt that they had either the responsibility or even the permission to do anything about it. I know it's more of a comment than a question, but just throwing it over.
And who would you like to address the question to?
Anyone who wants it.
All right. Who wants to take that? Just a comment then.
I mean, just to respond, because it merits a response, I think I've no doubt that's true, that there are cases where in a company, malware has been there and people think, well, I have no obligation to deal with this. I suspect if you pass that further up the management chain 5 years ago, might have agreed. If you do it now, if you do it in 5 years' time, you might get a slightly different answer. There's no event or not every event that triggers a regulatory obligation will be immediately obvious, but I think people will be will be thinking around this. We were talking off stage beforehand about, for example, the legal actions against chief information security officers in the United States. Would that have any impact on the way the industry thought and felt in the US and globally? And the answer is it probably will. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing remains to be seen. But what one point we were all discussing was that just because something's digital or security doesn't mean that sort of common sense obligations fall by the wayside. So, for example, some of the cases in the US are about did you cooperate with and tell the truth to regulators? That doesn't matter whether you're talking about cybersecurity or money or whatever. Similarly, is there an irregularity in the accounts? Well, you might want to do something about it. Is there some really dangerous code lurking around? You might want to do something about that too, because instinctively you kind of know that if you don't do something, you may be negligent and in breach of regulatory obligation. So I suspect that environment might be changing a little bit over time.
Thank you. Okay, with that, we'll wrap it up. I'd like to thank my panelists, Jen Ellis, Katie Masouris, Joseph Stevens and Kieran Martin. Please join me in showing your appreciation. Thank you.